Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome CEO Brand Leadership Group, Thebe Ikalafeng.
Good morning. I'm so glad everybody is awake so early. I thought I'm the only one awake this morning. I have on the panel with me this morning Michelle Harrison, who's the CEO of Government and Public Sector Practice from the WPP. Welcome. I have on the panel Adiat Disu from Adire Pire, PR and Communication. Welcome.
Thank you.
And I've got my Nigerian brother, Jacob Wood, from the Golden Gate. Welcome. We're talking about an important and very exciting topic this morning, how to transform the African brand. That is always, the beauty of it is that this is the central theme of the conference indeed today. But I want to start with the very first question. I want to put it up to my sister, Adiat. Adiat, you know, you Ghanaian, Nigerian?
Yes.
Based in New York?
Yes.
So you're a global African.
Yes.
And you're you've got an interesting initiative. You've got the Africa Fashion Week. What strikes me about that Africa Fashion Week is the biggest brand that Africans, particularly in the West Africa, tend to wrap themselves and to express themselves is Vlisco. Now, Vlisco, from what I understand, is from Holland. Has been around Africa for 200. How come Africans today have not been able to express themselves in their own identity?
The struggle for many brands, emerging African brands, whether it be in textile, whatever it is, across sectors, is the ability to establish its credibility among its peers and the ability for its peers to acknowledge them as credible. And it's a sociological issue that needs to be dealt with. But one of the things that I can say for emerging African brands, those competing against the Vliscos or any brand in any sector, is that one of the key things to any brand is the story. And then it's the positioning of its story globally, competing with other brands that are established. So being able to be not comparative, but of better quality than those brands that have been established. So when you're thinking about the African brand, the indigenous African brand, it's essential for that brand to understand the power of its story, but the power of quality. And then it all goes back down to VCs, venture capitalists. One of the struggles that many African brands face is the ability to seek that investment. I don't think it's about not knowing what needs to be done in terms of positioning. It's having the resources to position itself.
Thank you so much. I think I want to explore that later. But I also want to introduce, joining us on the panel at this moment is the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs from Uganda, from Louis Mushikwabo, from Rwanda. Honorable Minister, welcome. Thank you. I think it's important that as you settle down, as you know, throughout this week we had two very inspirational prime ministers, presidents from Gabon and from Rwanda, your Honorable Paul Kagame. And one of the things that he said is that as Africans, we need to work together because individually we are not going to be able to succeed. But how are you going to be able to do that when, if you think about the that Africa's 54 countries, all with their own jurisdictions and all those, how are we going to be able to control, if you will, the stories from the other African countries?
Thank you. I really think we have no choice. One, if we look at the brand of Africa and the descriptives of Africa, they come in a package. Nobody really goes through the 54 countries and picks all these good things each one of us has. It all comes in a big package. Africa is in the minds of so many a continent of opportunity, but a continent that is highly problematic. So on our side, we have got to bundle up, get together, and start demystifying that. So for me, it's not a question of how we do it, it's a question of how soon do we do it.
And I want to follow up on that question before I go to the other panelists. Now, Rwanda has had an amazing transformation in the last 20 years. And my one fascination is when I asked one gentleman at the Serena Hotel, I said, are you a Hutu or a Tutsi? And he said to me, I'm Rwandese. How are we going to... What lesson can we, or what insight can we learn from how Rwanda has been able to do that so that at one stage all Africans speak collectively?
The example you gave is a good opportunity for me to say one thing. This tribal division in my country came from Belgium. The colonizer arrived in Rwanda and decided to divide our society in terms of tribal belonging. Our differences were based on socio-economic standing. So what has happened through our history is that that division, which was not a division in the beginning, but just differences in our society, ended up hurting our country. So we decided 20 years ago, after the genocide, that we were not, as a nation, going to allow ourselves to be divided and defined by somebody else. Yet, when you read anything to this day on Rwanda, when people talk to us, just as you said, are you Hutu, are you Tutsi? And if you say I'm Rwandese, they look at you suspiciously. It's like, you cannot define yourself. We want to define you. So as a nation, we have taken our unity very seriously. And yet we find that non-Rwandans, especially those who are behind many, many years ago, this division, which was in the end almost a killer of our country, they still want to take us back. So even in terms of branding, if you look at it at the level of the country rather than the continent, yeah, we must got to say who we are, what we want, how we get where we want to go, even with the many, many difficulties.
So we have to take control of the story ourselves and the identity in terms of how we want to position ourselves.
We must tell our story. We must work aggressively to do that. And we should not be thinking that it's going to be easy, but that's where we should begin. We do not mind other people telling our stories, but by and large, we're absent in our own story as Africans.
Jacob, now I'm fascinated. You are Chinese. Now in 1990, I think China had 1 billion invested in Africa. Yeah, right. And I think by 2012 or 2013, they're up to 200 billion. They are in 53 of the 54 African countries. And when I spoke with you offline, you said to me, I'm Nigerian. What lesson do we take from the Chinese in terms of how they've been able to be part of the African story? That's the one side. But the other side of the question I want to know is, how do we avoid as Africans being turned into Chinese in Africa?
I look like Chinese, right? But I'm Nigerian. Anyway, I've been in Nigeria almost 40 years. But we say the China invest Africa, of course, yes. But why I say that? Number one, I'm very quite agree with Madam say that we have to talk our own story. What Africa? People know that Nigeria. People maybe I bring the people here. Huh? Bring my girls back, right? Although we're in province, yes, but we have to tell you that 200 girls in the, you can see the picture, right? The classroom not decent, The table is not so good. What are they doing there? The 200 girls went there to take an exam. They want to education. But only the way solution for the developed Africa is education.
It's education.
That means we have talk our own stories. But don't say, Africa danger, terrorism. No.
So we shouldn't be afraid as Africans
No.
that China, and I'm not asking you because I'm asking because you've got an insight into China and you've got an experience into Africa. So we shouldn't be afraid. Because, are you saying as well?
Not be afraid, because I used to be the advisor to Obasanjo for MSE. What I mean by MSE, the small middle enterprises. I told my Baba, Oga Obasanjo.
Okay.
He said, you stand up in the table or in the stage. Tell your Chinese peoples, you look handsome, you look healthy, you look very well. Africa is safe place for a guy to come in. That is my job, and which is do very well. You remember 2008, I know the fast learner, a gentleman from Jamaica.
Yeah.
What they eat? They eat yam. What I mean by yam? It's African food. Because he eat yam, they are done fast. This is our food.
I'm glad you talk.
Our African brand.
I'm glad you talk about food, you talk about African brand, and I want to switch to Michelle. Michelle, if you look at the Brand Finance, Brand Africa 100 list of the most valuable brands, 63% of them are non-African brands, and 33% or the balance are African brands. But of that balance, it is 72% South Africa, 26% Nigeria, and 2% only Kenya. And among the 100 most valuable brands from your WPP Brand Z100, there's only one African brand, MTN. What are African brands not doing, or what should they be doing to be heard globally? Or the second question I perhaps would link to that is, should we even bother trying to go global, or should we just try to be African? Because, being in Gabon for the last couple of days, I've only been eating, drinking, sleeping French.
Well, can I start by thanking the conference for having WPP here? And we're very, very pleased to be forming an alliance and investing in Attias Associates. So I think the starting point on Brand Z, which is a tool that is used around the world to understand the commercial strength of brands. The starting point there is, in many ways, what Brand Z does is it tracks the history of branding, because brands take a long time to build, and that story has to be sustained, and they require long-term commitment. So what Brand Z is capturing is the position now, and that reflects the last 20 or 30 years of all of the work and investment that's been done globally in commercial brands. So the fact that there is now an entrant from an African brand is the start of a new journey. Now, I think one of the things that we've recognized around the world, especially if we look at Asia and the work that we do on branding actually in China, what we're seeing is so much more work is being done on local brands growing and starting to export globally. So that seems to me that when we look ahead, the opportunities are very significant. However, brands and their nurturing and development require many different things. They require a vision, and as we've talked about, they require a story and then a huge amount of work to get them to reach their audience. So the future for African brands will be dependent on the extent to which they can be managed and invested in to reach that audience.
And yet, are we investing in that African story? How are you finding from outside, and you've come back now to Nigeria, and how are you finding this African story? Is it beginning to resonate? Are we loving Africa? Are we loving Made in Africa?
Oh, yes. You know that Africa will have a...
Jacob, are you Michelle? Are you Adiat?
Pardon me?
Are you Adiat?
He's Nigerian, remember?
You know Nigerians want to take over the show.
No.
I'll come back to you.
Born in China.
So
I'll come back to you. I want to get it from Adiat.
our ability to acquire investing and attract investing will be, based on what my sister here said, will be based primarily on our sustainability of our story. It takes time to develop a brand. Any great brand has taken years. Africa and its emergence of brands, it's fairly new. And it's one thing I will say, the generalization and the globalization of the concept of Africa is sexy, but each country, as my fellow sister has also stated, has a responsibility to identify itself, its core competencies, and the brands that are coming from each country. So when you look at Nigeria, what are those brands in beauty? What are those brands in fashion? What are those brands in design, decor, etc.? So we as individuals need to take pride in where we're from and our ability to create brands specifically where we're from, but also understand that it contributes to the whole story of Africa, which will attract investment over time.
So there's an individual responsibility as well. Minister, in terms of how have you been able to get the individuals in Rwanda, and take it from a micro and then macro, what will it take to mobilize African citizens to be able to tell this unified and attractive story of Africa?
I think the first step is to understand how important it is in this world today to be relevant. I came to politics from the world of public relations, and I know for a fact that even the Red Cross, has to have brand carriers. The most benign, innocent enterprise, charities want to be relevant. For Africa, it's very important, and I'll get to Rwanda in a second, that we understand that if we continue to be defined by a slew of experts, most of them from outside the continent, we are hurting our investment, we are hurting our tourism, and we continue to subtly contribute to the marginalization of Africa. So very first thing is we must realize that Africa needs to be present, and Africa is no paradise, but Africa is a continent that needs to be out there. It's the most important thing. Second, as a nation, I don't think, first of all, Rwanda has done very well, but Rwanda has a long way to go. So, I mean, we came from very far, but we still look ahead, and we're a country of very young people with great ambition. And I think what Michelle said, which is very important, it is hard work. But I don't believe we need to fall over ourselves trying to create an image, it's who we are in reality that is going to define us. It's like, for those of us in this room who know something about makeup, you can't apply makeup on a face that is not cleaned. So it's really who we are, but not staying back and being driven by others. It's who we are, but out there.
I want to ask Jacob, because Jacob, you published the first West African Unity magazine that goes out to China, Africa. Do you, just picking up from what the minister has said there, have you found that the reason China has grown so importantly in Africa is because they are understanding Africa better, because of the message that's going into China about Africa?
Okay,
I don't know if I'm leading the question.
Yeah, the Prime Minister of China just visited Africa, right? But he had kept a very important 3 points. Any investment from China to Africa, number one should be Africa need. Number two should be Africa agreed. Number three, which is important, should be Africa contribution and participate.
I love that. I love that. Africa need, agreed, a contribution, which
Africa contribution and participation.
And African participation.
Yes.
Michelle, when it comes to African participation, because now you had a public sector, and across Africa, I think Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, Botswana have got what you call brand country or country brand. Is it important to have those institutions, and what is their role, and what do they need to do to be successful?
Well, I think the starting point is, and just referring to some of the earlier comment, first of all, it's defining an authentic promise that you know is authentic, that you know is real, and that you want to make sure people here to define your own story. Yeah. I think the role of non-profit or governmental bodies is often an organising role, and it's the ability to bring together different stakeholders to work together on what is then a long-term plan. I think where we generally see the best results, though, the commercial sector is absolutely at the core, because country branding is about a series of different touch points that people will have with a country, whether it's as a tourist or as a business person, whether they're visiting, whether they're just reading about it. And it has to be an authentic experience so that when they do have that experience, it matches the promise that the brand has said. So I think you need the commercial sector right in at the heart of it. But if it doesn't feel true to the people of that country themselves, it will fail. And if you want to look at an example of that, it's Britain and European Union right now, but which tonight we will get the results of that outcome of the elections. But the idea that it's authentic and that it's owned by the people themselves is key.
Authentic and owned by the people, so it's a perfect time to ask the people in the audience some key questions they may have for the panel. There's a hand right at the back. Please identify yourself.
Thank you. My name is Alex Vines from Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. And it is about the country ban. My question is, how important is anti-corruption and human rights for transporting the African brand? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm gonna note the questions. I'm gonna take just two, three questions. Next question.
Ok, merci. Je suis Hans Charlie, étudiant à l'université Omar.
Thank you. I'm Hans Charlie, a student at Omar Bongo University. I don't have a question, but just a kind of answer on the transformation and African brand. And I do not believe, and I do not agree with you when they say that it takes so much time to transform African brand. We can do it in freedom. How? Why? The African brand must be produced in Africa, and it should take place in African continent, and we should develop an African market. And on that African market, how to develop it, we've got to incorporate within African things. We've got to introduce a specificity of the African culture, African people. And why? Because once the Rwandan people, when they create African brand, there should be the specificity of Gabonese culture, and the Gabonese entrepreneur, they should integrate in this African brand the specificity of Rwanda culture, and this will bring a kind of African cohesion where everybody will be integrated within this. So thank you, merci.
And that African brand must be produced in Africa. Next question, last question. Right at the back there.
Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, everyone. This is Ms. Niera. I'm a student in the Master's 2 program Finance at the Business Institute in Libreville. I wanted to make a comment on the different historical facts. I'd like to take the example of Gabon because it's my country. In the different teaching supports, sometimes we forget to talk about our own history, and we prefer to teach our children the history of France, the French Revolution, and so on, and very often we forget our own history. And so I think that it would be very important to integrate into our pedagogical supports and the different important facts concerning our own history before talking about the history of other countries. Thank you.
I think I want to wrap it up with those 3 questions. Very interesting questions, because the subject of Africa, whenever you talk about Africa, brand Africa, the subject of corruption always comes to the fore. And I'm not saying that it's a government responsibility, but I'd like perhaps to get a comment from the minister in terms of how important is it to manage that part of the brand with respect to perception of corruption, perception of lack of respect for human rights, which I think is the essence of the gentleman's question.
I'm trying not to be very controversial, but corruption is a reality on the continent, but corruption is not African. Corruption does not exist in Africa alone. At different levels, governments, businesses, and society in general. And I'm really glad to have that question, because this whole idea that it's almost as if in Africa we're either victims or brutes. You know, there are many, many normal people in Africa, and there are many, many good leaders in Africa. So what we need to do on our side is to highlight some of the practices against corruption. It's also important, I think, on the other side, the non-African side, to realize that this intangible notion of human rights is not the preserve of the West. We all aspire to the same things. We want justice. We want to have our say in the way we are governed. And there could be difficulties. I'm not downplaying that. But I think that's where the whole brand thing becomes tricky. I'm a foreign minister, so I cannot cite examples of countries, but I can line up for you a number of countries, government officials, not from Africa, who are very heavily involved in corruption, who abuse human rights. So while we need to do some work, no question about it, we have to do some work on the side of the continent. But I think it doesn't serve anybody to keep pushing certain dirty words on the African continent. It's not right. It's not right. Where we have to do some work, we must do some work. But there is a selective process where some countries and some places that bear interest or are friends with some Western quarters are deliberately ignored, or even some of the abuses of rights and corruption in the West are also kept quiet, while whatever is happening in Africa, and I'm not denying it, is propped up and highlighted to make the continent look so abnormal.
So it's a responsibility again of us as Africans to take a hold of that story.
No question about it. Nobody should be expected on this continent to have somebody else work for us. It's our responsibility.
Thank you so much, Minister, which brings me to Adia, this idea and the story of the history of Africa, because that's quite interesting, because I must say, it's my first time in Gabon. I did struggle a little bit looking for Gabonese in Gabon. And the young lady from Gabon there says the schools, Francophone African schools are teaching more the history of France, which I guess in many ways subdues the African identity. And is that the reason that we are finding such difficulty in expressing ourselves through products, goods, and services made in our countries?
Absolutely. I think one of the most important things that every brand should understand, and I look at each country as a brand, and those that manage that brand, each agency, each institution, is to understand that every individual is a brand ambassador. And every great brand needs a brand ambassador. And you can't have a brand ambassador with a lack of information about the brand.
So we need to give information about who we are, where we come from, and where we headed. Jakob, and how are you helping us as Africans, as a Chinese Nigerian? How are you helping us to ensure that the Golden Gate does not express all of China, but express a made in Africa identity? Because you've got a brand, Golden Gate, you're in 3 countries. And how African are those brands?
You know, Golden
And
Gate,
how did you get that? How did you involve Africans to ensure that it is a made in Africa product?
because Golden Gate is African brand, not Chinese brand. So, you know, because the important thing that like everybody understand Africa, we are very rich culture. Even I will talk the food. Let's say everyone knows the Noleu. If you travel from Dubai to China, you can see the Nigeria film. That's our African brand.
That's an African brand. Michelle, just in closing with the last question, perhaps to you. With your worldwide experience in this practice of country branding and nation branding, what lessons should we have, should we take in helping to build the African brand?
I think, I guess my final point would be that brands, whatever kind of brand, whether it's a product, a service, or a country, they do have to encapsulate authentic history, but they are also very much about saying what's next and about telling the story of the future. So New Africa, the brand that is being built by Africans, by African governments and by African businesses and by African commercial brands, is there for that story to be told and projected for the future. So of course it's about replacing some of the stories from the past that Africans may not feel are the ones they want to take with them into the future, but it has to be authentic and it has to have a vision of what's next.
So in transforming the African brand, there's going to be a need for clarity. There's going to be a need for collaboration. There's going to be a need for consistency. But most importantly, as Africans, we have to tell our story. Minister, Jacob, Adiad, Michelle, it's been brilliant.